we are joined by the best in the business, our friend Andy McCarthy, with legal analysis of this indictment and what's coming and all the rest of it. He's from National Review and Fox News, 20 years plus as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. Andy, give us your top line here, my friend. You read this indictment. What was your biggest takeaway?
Well, I think the indictment has lots of problems, Buck, but to cut to the chase, I think they're doing a political act that they're masquerading as a legal proceeding. I think it's driven by a political reason, that is the congressional process of impeachment failed, and that's not an acceptable outcome to the people who push this. So they're trying to do in the criminal arena what they couldn't get done in the congressional arena. The problem is it's not a good fit. And on the other end of it, I think they're doing it for the obvious political reason that they're trying to push this case to trial and then have it aired out in public with Capitol riot evidence that Smith has kind of insidiously inserted into the case, so that it can be in the front of voters' minds as they go to the polls in 2024.
So it's almost like this is part of the Biden reelection campaign. I mean, that's really, it's meant to coincide with Trump running and create at least a spectacle, if not a guilty verdict here, of all these things that Democrats have been talking about since 2020.
Yeah, I think we knew that, Buck, even before this ever came out, because remember, even though there are clear, long-known crimes in connection with Hunter Biden, the Justice Department has never appointed a special counsel and has never even indicted the case, even though there's a neon blinking conflict of interest there. On the other hand, the Biden Justice Department appointed a special counsel for Trump, even though there's no conflict of interest, which is what you're supposed to need to appoint a special counsel. So it seems to me it was obvious that the reason they did this, and I said it at the time, was they're planning. Biden and Garland had every intention of Trump being charged, and they want to argue because they knew that Trump was going to go on the campaign trail and say that Biden was using the justice system as a weapon against him. They wanted to come up with a political fiction by which they could tell people that they don't have anything to do with it. That is, the attorney general and the president don't have anything to do with it. So that's what they appointed Smith for. But it was always in their playbook, I think, that he was going to bring this case, and now he's brought it.
Where do you think the case here, the charges, where does it fall apart the most for you? Like, what are the areas where you just say, this should have never been brought?
I think, in particular, the first count, which is this conspiracy to defraud the government. And I've been writing about this since May, but the Supreme Court in May threw out two political corruption convictions against two cronies of former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. And what the court very clearly said was two things that I think Smith has totally ignored, even though in some ways they may even have been intended for him, or at least for prosecutors generally. And the first is, Buck, that fraud in the United States in federal law means what it meant when it was initially enacted in the end of the 19th century, which is it's a scheme to deprive somebody out of money or tangible property. And what the court said is that Congress has not successfully enacted a fraud statute that would extend fraud to other deceptive plans that don't involve bilking people out of money and property. And the court was very adamant, which is the reason they threw these cases out against the Cuomo guys, that prosecutors are not at liberty to make up such crimes, that if they're going to be those crimes, they have to be enacted by Congress, which obviously hasn't enacted it. So given that the Supreme Court did two decisions on one day about that in May, you would think that that would have come to the attention of a prosecutor who was winding up his investigation, because this is a harpoon right in the middle of it. And then I think, Buck, that generally what the court's message was an admonition to prosecutors that you are not at liberty to expand statutes beyond the coverage that Congress intended by manipulating ambiguous words like fraud or corruption. And that's exactly what Smith has done in this indictment. He indicted a fraud count that isn't fraud under federal law. He's indicted an obstruction count on a theory that it's corrupt to follow a specious legal argument. And he's indicted a civil rights count on, and this is perhaps as unbelievable as anything else. He's indicted a civil rights charge on the basis of a post-civil rights statute that was aimed at protecting blacks in the South from violent attacks by the Ku Klux Klan to try to prevent them from voting. So to analogize that to this, to me, is like fantasy land.
Now, let's look at the machinery of it a little bit now, or the how this process is going to play out. He's got a very clearly anti-Trump judge in a very clearly anti-Trump jurisdiction, Washington, D.C. Is this first, Andy, you think that they're going to fast-track this and have it happen before the election? How do you see this playing out on this case?
I think the only reason politically to bring it, and politics is the first-order issue for these guys, I think. The only reason to bring it is to get it in front of the electorate in time for the election. He made a point yesterday. I said on television, Buck, that I thought his press conference after the indictment was the most demagogic thing I had ever seen a federal prosecutor do in connection with a press conference like that. One of the things he said was he intended to get a speedy trial, which is code for, we're going to push this thing. And I think he's actually undermined his legal position for that, because if you really want to get this case to trial quickly, what you should have done is indicted this case first. Instead, he indicted the Mar-a-Lago case first and pushed the judge there into a May trial date. So, whether he likes it or not, Trump does have constitutional rights, including due process rights to mount a defense, which means to be able to investigate the case and to have time to process the charges and engage in litigation that a case like this calls for. But what Trump can argue is that Smith has intentionally and tactically undermined his fair trial rights by intentionally bringing this other lawsuit in Florida, which makes it much harder for Trump to defend himself in Washington. So even a anti-Trump judge, if that's what we turn out to have here, I think you have to sit up and take notice of that claim, because that's a profound legal claim.
And how worried are you, Andy, just as a person who's seen how this stuff goes over many years in federal courtrooms? A D.C. jury with these charges. I mean, you've given us your legal analysis of it, but are you concerned that there could be a guilty verdict here just based on anti-Trump animosity, or do you think that whether it's the appeals court or the Supreme Court, it's not even going to get to that level?
Well, I think, Buck, I'm more confident in the jury system than most people are, and I appreciate all the things about the Washington, D.C. jury pool. I think that Trump will have a more weighty argument to get the case moved out of the District of Columbia than most defendants have in federal cases, because the District of Columbia is small. It's not just that it's politically biased against him. The Capitol riot happened in Washington. Now, on that score, the reason I said that Smith was so demagogic yesterday, the Capitol riot really shouldn't have anything to do with this, because Smith hasn't charged him with the Capitol riot, and there's no evidence connecting Trump in a criminally actionable way to the violence of the Capitol riot. So it shouldn't be in the case at all. But Smith brought it up in his remarks yesterday after the indictment, which I thought was amazing, because he didn't really talk about the charges he had actually filed. He talked about what a terrible thing the Capitol riot was, and lauded the bravery of the police and other security forces who had been attacked as the building was attacked. that really shouldn't have anything to do with this case because Trump is in charge with it. Yet if you look at the indictment, flip toward the end, I think it's page 39 out of 45 pages, he's got 3 or 4 pages in there about the Capitol riot. Now, he hasn't charged the Capitol riot, but he put those pages in the indictment so that he can argue to the judge that he should be able to put evidence of the Capitol riot in. And I think that's waving the bloody shirt. He knows how weak his charges are, and he thinks he needs to get that. Even with a D.C. jury, he thinks that he needs to get that evidence into the case to have a chance to convict Trump. And a good judge will keep that evidence out of the case. But it, to me, Buck, is additional reason why there's a very good argument that the case ought to be moved out of the District of Columbia.
Andy McCarthy with us right now. Andy, are you confident that Trump is going to be able to beat all this stuff in the legal system? Put aside whether he can win politically, irrespective of these outcomes. Do you think that he's in pretty good shape to just make it through this gauntlet?
No, no one's ever been through a gauntlet like this before, Buck. And this goes to how political it is. There's a lot of people who've been the subject of a lot of litigation, including criminal and civil cases. You know, you and I collectively have enough experience in police and law enforcement and all that stuff that we could think of 5 or 6 people who were, thought to be heavy-duty criminals who had a lot of cases against them, both criminal and civil cases. But I've never seen a situation where you have one guy who suddenly got all these criminal and civil cases, which are not going to be spread out over a few years. This is all being fast-tracked so that this evidence and these trials can take place in the period of the election, in the campaign.
It sounds like, Andy, you agree with me that it seems suspicious that this guy lived 77 years of his life, and in the 77th year, he's facing 2 federal indictments, a criminal indictment in New York, possibly another one in Georgia, and also a state investigation in New York.
And that they're in a hot panic to get it to trial, in the next 5 minutes. I'm like, if you're the government and you know that somebody is facing all these other trials, you don't want to create a record that he doesn't have, that his due process rights haven't been honored, and that he didn't have a opportunity to prepare for your trial. And if you're Smith, you could prosecute the same case, Buck, on December 1st of 2024 as, before Election Day. And it wouldn't prejudice the government in the slightest. But they're in a hot panic to get this case to trial because they want it before the election. That's the whole point.
Do you think they're going to get it before the election, Andy? Andy?
It really depends on the judge. Yeah, I'm thinking about it, Buck. It really depends. You ask me these hard questions, Buck. I have to take a second to think. It depends on the judge. It really does depend on the judge. And it depends on whether Trump can come up with some reason that he gets to appeal before the trial. There's a lot of reasons, Buck, because of the classified information aspects of it, that Trump could appeal the Mar-a-Lago case prior to trial, because there's provisions in the classified information law that allow for that. I'm not seeing a lot of good basis to try to get this appealed prior to trial, and he's going to have to come up with some, because I think the judge in this case has to know the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court are looking.
Go read Andy's latest. It's Trump's January 6th indictment, a political scheme to influence the next election. It is up at clayandbuck.com, originally posted at themessenger.com. But go to clayandbuck.com. You'll have the cross link there. Andy, we're going to be talking to you a lot, sir, so get some rest. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure, Buck. Thank you so much.